In the early 2000s, I decided to take a solo hiking trip deep into a forest that locals often described with a mix of reverence and unease. The place was known for its towering trees, some said ancient beyond memory, whose thick branches knitted the sky into a dim canopy. The silence there was almost unnatural, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. I was drawn to that quiet, a desire to escape the noise and distractions of daily life, to lose myself in the vastness of the wilderness. Preparation was minimal but deliberate. I packed light, a small tent, basic food supplies, water, a map, and a compass. No phone, no GPS, just the essentials. There was a part of me that wanted to be truly alone, untouched by technology or human contact. The forest was remote, the trails poorly marked, and the knowledge that I'd be cut off from civilization both excited and unsettled me. People warned me about wandering in these woods alone, but I assured myself I was cautious enough. I started my hike late in the morning, the sun filtering weakly through the dense canopy above. The air was cool and damp, filled with the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. At first, the path was easy to follow, a narrow dirt trail winding between ancient pines and firs. As I walked, the sounds of the outside world faded, no distant traffic, no chatter of hikers, just the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I felt a strange calm settle over me, as if the forest itself was embracing my presence. After several hours, the trail grew faint, and I found myself stepping off the beaten path, guided by instinct more than anything else. The underbrush thickened, and the ground was uneven, littered with roots and fallen branches. I crossed a small creek, its water clear and cold, and decided this would be a good spot to set up camp for the night. The creek's gentle babbling was a soothing backdrop, and a small clearing nearby offered enough space for my tent. As I pitched the tent, the light began to shift. The sun lowered behind the trees, casting long shadows that stretched and twisted across the forest floor. The temperature dropped noticeably, and a thin mist started to rise from the damp earth. I gathered some dry wood for a fire, careful to keep it contained and small. Sitting by the flames, I prepared a simple meal, the warmth of the fire contrasting with the growing chill in the air. The forest around me felt alive in a way I hadn't expected, every rustle, every crack of a branch seemed amplified in the quiet. I tried to focus on the beauty, the way the firelight flickered against the trunks of the trees, the stars beginning to peek through gaps in the canopy, the cool night air carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. It was peaceful, almost serene, and for a moment I felt completely at ease. But as darkness deepened, the forest's mood shifted. The peaceful sounds gave way to something more fragmented, a series of soft noises that didn't quite fit. I heard the faint snap of a twig, distant but distinct, like a footfall breaking the silence. There was a whisper carried on the wind, subtle and elusive, as if voices were speaking just beyond comprehension. The shadows between the trees seemed to grow thicker, more defined, as if something was watching from the edges of my vision. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks in the dark. The forest was full of animals and natural sounds, there was no reason to be afraid. Yet, every time I looked toward the deeper woods, I caught glimpses of movement, shapes that disappeared when I blinked or turned my head quickly. The flickering firelight cast dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes, but the unease remained. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipping the flap closed, hoping the fabric would create a barrier between me and whatever lurked outside. Lying on my sleeping pad, I listened intently to the sounds beyond the tent. The creek's steady murmur was joined by occasional rustlings, branches brushing together, leaves shifting, footsteps too light to be certain. The darkness pressed in close, wrapping around me like a thick blanket. Despite the cold, sweat beaded on my forehead as I tried to steady my breathing. I reminded myself of the countless people who camped in remote places without incident. Still, the forest felt different here, older, deeper, and somehow watchful. I found myself scanning the tent's thin walls, imagining shadows pressing against the fabric, fingers tapping softly as if trying to communicate. Sleep was elusive. Every time I started to drift off, a strange noise would pull me back to alertness, a soft sigh, a distant crack of wood, a whisper carried on the wind. My mind raced through possibilities, wildlife, other hikers, or simply the forest's natural symphony. But the intensity of the sounds made it impossible to settle. The night stretched endlessly, each minute thick with anticipation. At one point, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, flashlight in hand, shining the beam into the darkness. The light caught the rough bark of trees, the tangled undergrowth, and the glistening surface of the creek. I scanned slowly, heart pounding, but saw nothing unusual. No eyes reflecting in the beam, no figures lurking beyond the firelight. Just the quiet forest, indifferent and vast. I returned to the tent, closing the flap behind me, but the sense of being watched lingered. I told myself it was nothing, that these woods were simply unfamiliar and mysterious. Yet as the wind shifted, carrying a chorus of low, indistinct whispers, I felt the solitude deepen into something more profound, an ancient presence that didn't welcome visitors. Despite the growing fear, I remained rooted in my choice to be alone here. This was why I had come, to experience the wild in its rawest form, to confront that isolation and find peace within it. But as the night wore on, the forest's silence seemed less like peace and more like a waiting breath, holding something just beyond reach. I lay back down, eyes wide open, listening to the creek and the shifting shadows. Somewhere out there, beyond the fire's glow, the forest held its secrets close. I could only wait and wonder what the dawn would bring. As dusk deepened, the uneasy quiet that had settled around my camp began to unravel in subtle, unsettling ways. The forest's natural chorus, the gentle babbling of the creek, the rustle of leaves, the occasional call of an owl, started to shift into something more fragmented, less familiar. Branches snapped in the distance, but not with the rhythm of an animal's cautious steps. These were deliberate, crisp cracks, like something heavy pressing and breaking through underbrush. I froze, gripping my flashlight tighter, eyes darting into the growing shadows beyond the firelight's reach. A faint whispering carried on the wind, so soft that at first I thought it was just the rustling of leaves. But there was an unmistakable cadence to it, a low murmur threading through the air in a pattern almost like speech. I strained to catch the words, but they dissolved into silence before I could make sense of anything. My heart pounded harder, the warmth of the fire suddenly inadequate against the creeping chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. Then, from the edge of the clearing, between two massive fir trees, I caught sight of a figure. At first, it was just a shadow, a dark shape standing motionless where the trees thickened. The figure was tall, oddly still, and somehow out of place in the otherwise animated forest. I blinked, certain my eyes were playing tricks, but when I looked again, it remained. No movement, no gesture, just a silent silhouette framed by the dimming light. I called out, my voice cracking the silence. "Hello. Are you lost?" The sound felt harsh and intrusive in the quiet woods. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even shift. I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself it was probably another hiker or a hunter, someone else caught out after dark. But the stillness was unnatural, almost deliberate, and a primal unease settled deep in my gut. I fumbled for my flashlight and aimed the beam toward the figure. The light swept over the shadowy form, but it was as if the darkness swallowed the glow. No face, no eyes reflecting back, just an absence, an outline against the trees that didn't belong. My fingers tightened around the flashlight handle, the knuckles white, as I watched the figure suddenly dissolve into the woods, vanishing as silently as it had appeared. Shaken, I scanned the tree-line for any sign of movement. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds had ceased, as if even the animals were wary of whatever had just passed through. I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Could it have been a trick of the fading light, a shadow cast by the swaying branches? But the figure had been too distinct, too solid for that. I called out again, my voice barely above a whisper this time, hoping for some kind of response, some reassurance that I wasn't alone in this strange place. Nothing answered except the wind, which carried those low, teasing whispers again, circling around me like a cold breath. I shivered, though the fire still crackled at my side, and forced myself to believe this was just my imagination, that the forest's loneliness was playing games with my mind. I returned to my tent, trying to convince myself to rest. But the image of that shadowy figure lingered in my thoughts, an unshakable presence at the edge of my vision. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my heart racing, and every time I looked toward the trees, I half expected to see that silhouette waiting silently just beyond the firelight. Sleep was elusive. I lay awake, the tent walls seeming thinner than before, as if the forest itself pressed close, watching and waiting. The whispers persisted, soft and unintelligible, weaving through the night air in a haunting melody that I couldn't place. At times, I thought I heard footsteps circling the camp, but whenever I opened the tent flap to look, the woods were empty, still and expectant. In the early hours, when the fire dwindled to glowing embers, I thought I heard breathing, not my own, but slow and steady, just beyond the edge of the clearing. My flashlight beam caught nothing but empty trees and the shimmering creek. Yet the sound lingered, a reminder that I was not as alone as I had hoped. The night stretched on in this fractured state, a liminal space between calm and terror. The forest seemed to shift around me, alive with secrets and shadows, and I was caught in its silent gaze. The figure, the whispers, the sounds, they were all part of something I couldn't explain, something old and watchful. As dawn approached, the whispers faded, replaced once again by the natural sounds of the forest waking. Birds began to call tentatively, the creek's babble grew clearer, and the cool mist lifted from the ground. The shadowy figure was gone, leaving only the memory of its silent presence. I packed up my camp quickly, the weight of the night's fear heavy on my shoulders. Though the sun was rising, the forest still felt vast and unknowable, its mysteries far from solved. The isolation that had once felt like an escape now pressed in like a warning. I moved carefully, eyes scanning the trees, wondering what else lay hidden in the depths of this ancient place. The moments after dawn brought a fragile sense of relief, but as the day wore on, that uneasy feeling from the night refused to fade. I spent the morning packing my gear with deliberate care, eyes constantly flicking toward the thick woods that had swallowed the shadowy figure the night before. The forest looked different in daylight, less menacing, more familiar, but the memory of whispered voices and silent watches lingered like a weight I couldn't shake. I decided to stay close to the creek, hoping the sound of running water would drown out any remaining unease. The trail was muddy and uneven, and the dense canopy still filtered the sunlight into a dim, greenish glow. Every step felt heavy, as if the forest itself was resisting my departure. The deeper I ventured, the more the sense of isolation intensified. I was alone here in a way I hadn't anticipated, not just physically, but in a way that felt cosmic, as if the woods were vast beyond comprehension and I was a tiny, fragile intruder. That night, I camped again near the creek, setting up my tent with practiced hands but a jittery heart. The forest had quieted a bit, but the silence was thick, like a held breath waiting to be released. I sat by the fire, trying to focus on the crackling flames and the warmth they brought, but every shadow beyond the light seemed to pulse with hidden life. As darkness fell, the subtle noises that had haunted me returned with renewed intensity. Branches snapped sharply, close enough to be deliberate, not the random sounds of wildlife. Leaves rustled with no visible cause, whispers floated on the breeze, now clearer but still indecipherable, like a language just beyond understanding. My gaze kept drifting to the woods, where I thought I saw movement, fleeting shapes that vanished when I blinked. Then, just beyond the circle of firelight, I spotted it again, a figure standing motionless among the trees. This time, it was closer, more defined, a pale face, almost ghostly against the dark bark, eyes wide and unblinking. The figure didn't move or speak, just watched me with an intensity that froze me in place. I called out, voice shaky, but it didn't respond. Instead, the figure raised a pale hand in a slow, deliberate gesture before stepping back, disappearing silently into the shadows. My heart pounded as I scanned the woods, the fire crackling loudly in the oppressive silence that followed. I wanted to believe it was another hiker, perhaps someone lost or seeking refuge, but the stillness and the eerie calm in that face suggested something else, something not quite human. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, a primal warning that whatever I was facing was beyond explanation. I retreated into my tent, locking the flap and clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. Sleep was impossible, every crack and whisper kept me on edge. Hours later, I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling the campsite. Slow, deliberate steps that crunched over twigs and leaves, never stopping, never quickening. I held my breath, heart racing, as the sound moved closer, paused for a moment just beyond the tent, then continued its slow circuit. Fearing what might be outside, I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent quietly, shining the beam into the darkness. The light caught the rough texture of tree trunks, the swirling mist, but no figure met my gaze. The footsteps had stopped. I scanned frantically, heart pounding, but the woods were empty. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a dark shape darting quickly past one of the tent windows. It was gone before I could focus, leaving only the echo of its movement in the still night. Panic surged through me. I scrambled down from the tent and grabbed my backpack, the flashlight beam trembling in my grasp. Without thinking, I plunged into the woods, heart hammering in my chest as I ran blindly through the trees. The terrain was rough and unfamiliar, roots and rocks caught my feet, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The sounds of pursuit, or perhaps just my imagination, echoed behind me, snapping branches, rustling leaves, the faintest echo of footsteps. I didn't stop until I broke through the tree line and spotted the faint glow of a ranger station in the distance. Exhausted and trembling, I made my way toward it, relief flooding me as I neared safety. The station was quiet in the early morning light, but the presence of other people grounded me, pulling me back from the edge of terror. Inside, I explained my situation to the ranger, who listened with a mixture of concern and skepticism. They warned me about the dangers of solo hiking in the area and the importance of sticking to marked trails, but no one could account for the strange figure or the noises I described. Despite their reassurances, I felt the lingering weight of the forest's silence press down on me, a reminder that some mysteries there might never be explained. That night, as I rested in the safety of the ranger station, the images of the shadowy figure and the circling footsteps haunted my dreams. The forest's grip was strong, its presence palpable even beyond its borders. I knew returning to civilization was necessary, but a part of me remained entangled in those woods, caught between fear and fascination, unable to let go of the secrets I had glimpsed in the dark. Weeks after my frantic escape to the ranger station, I found myself drawn back to the forest, unable to resist the pull of those ancient woods despite the fear that still clung to me. This time, I chose a different spot, an abandoned logging trail farther from the creek, where the trees stood taller and the underbrush was thicker. I felt better prepared, more cautious, determined to face whatever mystery had unsettled me before. The trail was lined with fallen logs and rusted equipment, remnants of a forgotten industry slowly being reclaimed by nature. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the silence here was different, less oppressive, but still charged with an eerie stillness. Setting up camp near a decaying stump, I made sure to keep my fire small and my gear close, my senses sharpened by past experience. That first night passed without incident, but the following morning, as I stepped outside my tent, I noticed something that sent a chill through me, fresh footprints in the soft mud near the water's edge. They were bare feet, small and oddly shaped, as though belonging to someone who had been walking lightly and carefully. I hadn't seen or heard anyone else around, and the prints led off into the dense woods, disappearing beneath a thick mat of needles. Unease crept in. Had someone been watching me? The thought was unsettling, but I tried to brush it off as a fellow hiker or perhaps a local passing through. Still, the feeling of being observed settled like a weight on my chest. I spent the day exploring cautiously, always glancing over my shoulder, every shadow seeming to flicker with hidden movement. That evening, as darkness fell and I sat by the fire, the forest seemed to close in tighter. The usual sounds of nocturnal wildlife were muted, replaced by an almost suffocating silence. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I caught sight of two figures standing just beyond the firelight's reach. Their faces were pale, almost ghostly in the dim glow, and they stood perfectly still, watching me with eyes that reflected an unnatural light. I froze, unable to speak or move, as the taller figure raised a hand slowly, a silent greeting or perhaps a warning. The woman beside him suddenly bolted into the darkness, vanishing with a speed that seemed unnatural, like she was a shadow slipping between trees. The man remained, standing motionless and barefoot, his gaze fixed on me. After several tense moments, he too turned and retreated silently into the woods. Panic surged through me. The air felt charged, electric with an unseen presence. I scrambled to pack my things, my hands shaking as I extinguished the fire. The forest around me seemed alive with eyes, watching, waiting. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to put distance between myself and whatever those figures represented. I set off into the dark, moving quickly but carefully through the tangled underbrush. The moon was a thin crescent, offering little light, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified in the stillness. Then, from the shadows, I heard it, running footsteps, fast and urgent, closing the distance behind me. I dared not look back, fearing what I might see, and pushed myself harder, heart pounding in my ears. After what felt like hours, I burst through the trees to the edge of a service road where my truck was parked. The headlights pierced the darkness, a beacon of safety. I didn't slow until I was inside, doors locked and engine roaring. As I pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see figures chasing me. But the forest was silent once more, the shadows retreating behind the trees. That night, safe in my vehicle, I tried to make sense of what I had experienced. The footprints, the silent watchers, the sudden flight, none of it fit any logical explanation. The forest had revealed another layer of its mystery, one that felt darker, more personal. I realized then that this place held secrets far beyond the usual dangers of the wilderness, and that I was no longer just an observer, but a participant in something I barely understood. As I drove away, the weight of the forest's gaze followed me, a lingering presence that refused to fade with distance. The isolation I had sought had turned into a creeping paranoia, and I knew that returning to these woods would forever be a journey into the unknown. Months later, seeking refuge from the chaos of everyday life, I found myself parked in a remote clearing, living out of my camper van deep in the wilderness. The spot was secluded, far from roads and neighbors, surrounded by towering pines whose branches swayed softly in the evening breeze. I hoped the solitude would bring a sense of peace long denied to me. As night fell, I settled inside the van, the soft glow of my laptop screen casting a pale light across the cramped interior. Outside, the forest was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and distant calls of nocturnal creatures. I was just about to shut down for the evening when I noticed something strange, a flicker of light reflected on the screen, subtle but distinct. I glanced toward the windows, but the thick darkness beyond revealed nothing, no movement, no glow, just the deep blackness of the woods. Unease crept in, but I told myself it was probably a trick of the light or a passing car's distant headlights. Still, the feeling lingered, a prickling at the back of my neck. I closed the laptop and turned off the interior lights, plunging the van into darkness. The silence outside was heavy now, almost oppressive. Then, faint knocking sounded on the van door, a soft, deliberate tapping that sent a jolt through me. My heart raced as I strained to listen. The knocks came again, steady and rhythmic, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I peered through the small window, but the forest remained shrouded in shadows. No figure stood outside, no silhouette to be seen. A voice whispered next, barely audible, close enough that I could feel the breath against the van. It claimed to be from the sheriff's department, explaining that there had been reports of a missing person in the area and that they needed to check on my safety. My mind raced, torn between relief and suspicion. The voice was calm but carried an edge that didn't sit right with me. Something about it felt off, too smooth, too rehearsed. I called out through the door, asking for identification, but the voice only repeated its claim, urging me to open up. Fear surged through me. I knew from past experience that strangers in the woods, especially at night, weren't always who they claimed to be. My instincts screamed that this was a deception, a trap. Without hesitation, I grabbed my keys and started the engine, the van's lights piercing the darkness. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by hurried footsteps pounding against the forest floor. I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught fleeting shadows rushing toward the van from the tree line. Panic surged as I shifted into gear and sped away, tires crunching over gravel and dirt. The figures chased me briefly, but the van's power and my adrenaline-fueled reflexes kept me ahead. As I drove further from the clearing, the shadows dissolved into the night, and the knocking ceased. My hands trembled on the wheel, heart hammering as I navigated winding forest roads back toward civilization. When I finally reached a gas station and reported the incident to the local authorities, they confirmed no sheriff's deputies had been dispatched to that area that night. The truth settled over me like a cold weight. I had narrowly escaped an encounter with unknown men who had used authority as a guise to get close. That night, as I parked in a well-lit lot far from the woods, the memory of those knocking sounds and whispered lies haunted me. The forest that once held a strange allure now felt like a trap, a place where isolation bred danger and where the line between reality and fear blurred. I knew I would never return to those woods, not after what I had experienced. The haunting presence of those encounters remained with me, a chilling reminder of the vulnerability that comes with being truly alone in the dark.